right. Good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I am Ria. My call sign is N2RJ, and welcome to another episode of Live with Ria. Um, Tonight, yeah, we're going to talk about Baofangs a little bit, but we're going to talk about radio performance in general. I must preface this and say this is not, any kind of telling people your radio is bad. It is giving you good information on the state of transceiver performance. And I say transceiver because it does more than just receivers. So tonight, my guest is Rob Sherwood, NC0B. He is a very renowned authority in independent radio testing. So he's not paid by the manufacturers. He's not paid by the radio stores. I don't think he's even paid by the ARRL, to be honest. He might be volunteering with the ARRL, and he does, a lot of interesting independent testing. So, I trust what he says very much because I think that he definitely brings some good things to the table. That said, not everybody will agree with him, but the numbers don't lie. So, without further ado, I bring in here Mr. Sherwood. Hey, Rob, how is it going?
Good evening. Nice to be your guest tonight.
Yeah, that's really nice to see you. I call you Mr. Sherwood because you are an authority, okay? But anyway, no, I call you Rob too.
Yeah,
But
Rob's
anyway,
good.
Rob. Okay, so Rob, you are in whereabouts in the United States?
Well, part of the time I'm in Denver. And
Mm-hmm.
when I started testing radios in 1976, I certainly was in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
And then spent some time northwest of Boulder for about 7 years at my mother-in-law's cabin and did operating there. But then here for the last 15 years, I'm about 45 miles east of WWV in Fort Collins, out here in the Pawnee grasslands where I've got a 10-acre antenna farm that's been a joy to build.
Nice. Yeah. Have you ever done any work at WWV or?
No, but I visited. Of course, it wasn't
Okay.
after 9/11 and it was pretty much shut down. But then there were a few cases when we had an ARRL convention that we got to visit it. And then just recently, this past November, I was at
Mm.
in Hawaiian Islands and got to see WWVH, which was really hard to do, but I had an in.
Okay. So just before we start, we have this is an interactive thing. Of course, my audience asks questions, and if you see anything you want to address, just let me know, or just call it out, and I'll put it out on the screen. Like for example, like this person says, greeting from Union, Missouri, and from N0YCX. So we could always pop it up on the screen. Um, Sundays with Ria. Yeah, I like live with Ria because I don't always stream on Sunday. Okay. All right. So, but first of all, I like people to know who I'm talking to. How'd you get involved in ham radio?
Well, in the late 50s, I had a radio that would pick up Cincinnati police, and I was like 100 miles away from there, and the low band transmission was on 1706 kilohertz, just below 160 meters, and I could
Mm-hmm.
hear one end of the conversation. So then my uncle had an old radio that had an AM, FM, and a shortwave band on it. I mean, one band.
Mm.
And our TV repairman refixed it, and I started listening to shortwave. So that would have been 58, 59. And then I moved to Cincinnati with my family, or my family moved me to Cincinnati in 1960.
Wow. There's always some good stories about TV repair people because I know one other famous ham famously got involved in ham radio due to a TV repair shop. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I don't.
Yeah, Bill Pasternak, WA6ITF. He
Oh,
he he first got involved due to a shop in Brooklyn, New York, I believe it was. So
so is that the same Pasternak that if you want to, they have some interesting like things you can calculate by going
mhm.
to their website, or is that a different Pasternak?
No, that's from Amateur Radio Newsline. So
Okay.
yeah. Oh, I mean, he was great. Of course, he's silent key now, but yeah, no, but this had even in my like first things with electronics. I mean, we had like an old color TV. We're actually one of the first people to have a color TV My dad bought that in the 70s before I was born. And then uh, it was a 19-inch sharp. So this is in Trinidad. Okay, we had a sharp color TV, and this was a big old heavy son of a whatever, you know. And it had like a separate flyback transformer and a tripler, and a big TO3 horizontal output, and oh god, and a hot chassis. Okay.
Well, when I was young,
Yeah.
I could hear the horizontal oscillator. It used to drive me nuts.
Hmm.
Can't hear them anymore. But of course, we don't have 16 kilohertz or 15 point whatever it is anymore in TVs.
Oh, I used to hear them. And we also had like a 12-volt TV, but it was black and white. My dad took an electronics course from NTS in California, correspondence, but that was interesting. Okay, so I'm going to show a couple pictures here, right? One of them here is your mobile rig here. So, and then you could probably tell us a little bit about what you do in the mobile. Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. So this is an interesting beast. This has a capacity hat and everything. And what is that?
Okay, well, that's my current mobile. Although I've been interested in mobile for years, wrote an article in Ham Radio Magazine, I believe in 1989, and the subsequent. But this is a homemade resonator with a B&W coil, and obviously a homemade capacity hat and a whip. So, and if you can see there closely right on top the car, well, there's an aluminum plate that's hooked on the luggage rack, and that's an Icom auto tuner hooked up to a 706 Mark II-G.
Wow.
Now, if I've got coil in the circuit, I can only work that one band. But if I short it out, which, 40 meters or 75, this is a big deal, having some loading coil in there. But if I'm wanting to work 20 through 6, I just short out all the coil, and the auto tuner will tune it from, well, you can actually work 40 with a 3 dB degradation compared to with the coil, and then 20 and up, it hardly matters.
Wow. Have you seen my friend Andrea's mobile? K2EZ, the one, the rover at Dayton.
Well, I've seen, yeah, probably so. I mean, there have been sometimes you wonder, well, isn't there a lot of interaction with 5 antennas on a car? But I've only got 2.
I think she has more than 5 by now.
Yeah, it could be.
She has like 10. Oh my
goodness.
god. Yeah, that's cool. And then one more thing I'm going to show you, you guys, is this article in CQ Magazine. So those of you who don't know, CQ Magazine has resumed their print publication now. And then it's always all about the antenna. Many HF mobile installations are seriously compromised by the mounting position of the antenna. There are convenient places to mount an HF antenna. And there are efficient ways to mount the antenna. Sometimes they may cause the XYL. Now, for those of you not hams, XYL means, it used to mean non-married spouse, but I think wife, okay, not male spouse, but it means a wife. So to blink, but my goal has always been able to carry an HF mobile QSO for 20 to 30 minutes at a time with only 100 watts. I do that regularly on my trips between Denver and my contest stations east of Fort Collins, Colorado. You may see pictures on QRZ. If you read Tom's website, link above, one aspect we evaluated was whether the plate above the roof need to be grounded. His next simulations indicated it doesn't much matter, which we proved in our initial experiments. However, that conclusion is likely affected by the size of the plate. So I assume this was prior to the RAV4.
Yeah, that was one before. I unfortunately got T-boned at an intersection in Denver, so that car went away. I didn't have a mobile car for a few days, and then I bought the RAV4. But the same concept, the same. There was the same antenna tuner was under the plate in this case because there was room, and the current one, it won't fit under the plate, so it doesn't make any difference.
And then Rob and your friend Tom Thompson, W0IVJ, who I believe was probably watching this video. I don't know. I've been making mobile transmitting measurements for the past years. Now, what is this mobile transmitting measurements? Because I'm curious now.
Well, it was done several times in the Boulder area, and we would use either a spectrum analyzer or like an SDR, and then switching different well, like different people would show up, like maybe a half a dozen to a dozen hams would show up, and they park the car in the same place, and someone else, like a few football fields away, would be making a measurement. So actually having the antenna right in the center of the roof is the most efficient.
Mm.
Even on, you might say, well, how in the world would that work with the ground clearance? But you can have an 8-foot antenna not hidden anything, except a tree, of course. But the big bridges will clear that. Some
Yeah.
people think on 160 you really want to hook on the bumper, but I don't still buy that. It seems like you're reduce your ground losses by having it in the center of the metal.
Okay. And I guess the proof is in the pudding because you used to hold QSOs for like half an hour at a time on mobile. Okay. I use a screwdriver antenna, but I chicken out and I use a trunk lip mount, on an old Honda Accord. So
well, you do what you can do.
yeah. But this would have been interesting. That car didn't have a roof rack, but my other car, 2013 Toyota Sienna, had one. And I was thinking of putting an HF mobile, but long story short, I just stopped driving that car because I got my Tesla, and then, I just don't really drive that anymore, so I sold it. But anyway, so that's a different story. I've been going different directions with cars.
I have mobiled once in a Prius, and maybe like your Tesla, since it's got regenerative braking and all that, a lot of RF interference. So the Prius for me was a disaster, but I did it once all the way to California and back, but certainly not my first choice.
Yeah, I've been actually working on an update to a video I have about the Tesla Mobile. And my Tesla actually went in the shop because I hit a pothole in Long Island, and because of that, it ended up in the shop for like 2 months. Major suspension damage, and they also had to replace a drive unit motor. But you're right about the regen braking, and the regen braking is so bad, it actually wipes out the AM band. Now, the thing about the Tesla, though, is that you can adjust the regen braking to actually be weak or strong. And if you put in weak, the RF interference is a little less, but it's still not ideal compared to, a gas or diesel car, especially a diesel, because diesels, they don't have the, same issues.
But one ham told me that he had a diesel and the
Yeah.
fuel injectors made terrible racket. So he got rid of the diesel.
Wow. The National Radio Quiet Zone near the Green Bank Telescope, they actually use diesels because they're supposedly RF quiet. But I didn't, I guess a fuel pump could be a problem.
I've been to that location on a trip.
Yeah.
It was a spur of the moment. It was a great trip. If you're going to be near Green Bank, absolutely go. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. I loved it. You might have seen, I don't know if you might have seen, I don't have it offhand here. I took a nice picture from a distance of the telescope with the landscape, and it was beautiful. The problem is I couldn't use my digital camera up front, so I used film. I have pictures on film that I took. So anyway, all right. So okay, so that's great. So people know you now, and what they know, what a lot of people, their first introduction to you is your receiver test chart, and you are well known, right? I first came to know of you because you have a receiver test chart that you test a bunch of different receivers here at Sherwood Engineering. And I'm going to bring it up and show the audience just, what exactly I mean, those who don't know. So what Rob does is he goes to different, I think he either buys the radios or gets them on loan or something like that. No manufacturer is saying review this radio and we'll pay you money, right? Rob is
no one's ever paid me a dime.
Good. That's great because you don't want people to to do that because then you can't trust the results, right? But anyway, this receiver test chart here shows a bunch of different radios, and they have a ranking. But I've always told people, anything above, say, like a certain number of I believe you sort them by dynamic range narrow space.
Right.
Anything above like 90 is really going to be good for people. So you have like the 7610, you have all these Flexes and the Elecraft and the Yezus and Anon and Hiberline, So, but how did this get started? What made you do this?
Okay, and that's a fluke, but life sometimes strange things happen. So I
Mm,
had a Drake R4C, and my partner in the amateur radio business in Cincinnati, George K at RH, also had one, and we used to
mm,
work the 160-meter contest. And my 160-meter contesting goes back to around 1963 in the Cincinnati area,
mm,
and so we found that the R4C got reviewed as a good receiver, but in a CW pileup, it was a disaster. So if the radio performs poorly in a contest, but the lab tests say it's good, well, then the test isn't accurate. So I
mm,
said, okay, there's got to be some way to figure out what's wrong with it. So I just changed the parameters for the testing, and all of a sudden it came obvious why certain radios that had a wide first IF and then a lot of gain and then the final selectivity, which could be back then crystal filters or something,
mm,
mechanical filters, whatever, that the performance drastically dropped. So I started testing radios. Certainly, I've never owned. There's 150 transceivers or more, and a few receivers, of course. I would borrow them from what used to be the predecessor of ham radio outlet in Denver. It was called CW Electronics, and Alan
mm.
Applegate, who's a big mobiler, if you may know Alan.
Oh, I know him. He's
Yes.
great.
Well, he used to manage the store, and I could borrow rigs like on a Friday afternoon and take them home and test them over the weekend and bring them back on Monday because I couldn't possibly get a hold of 150 rigs. Of course, there were 150 back then. So I used to publish this in paper form. And so what I did was figured out how to fix the Drake R4C. And that
Mm,
started this cottage industry that existed up until the last year and a half about doing upgrades for that radio. And for the longest time until the Orion 1 came along, that modified R4C with a special roofing filter actually was top on the chart. Well, it's long gone now as far as that, but technology has changed a massive amount. But that was the only reason I ever got into testing was because a radio I had didn't work right, and I figured out how to test it and then figured out how to fix it.
hmm. Right. And then, some of these test criteria. So I looked at your terms explained, and I'm going to show this now. And you have like a whole bunch of criteria. See, I'm a nerd, okay? So I love this stuff, right? I really love how you explain, but I love how you explain it to people. You don't just tell people like, here's a chart. These are the best radios on the top, and these are the crap radios at the bottom. Okay, these are the, you know, yeah. But then you explain like the AGC threshold, blocking, sensitivity, phase noise, front end selectivity, and dynamic range. So I'll jump right into this. Why are these radios ranked the way they are?
Well, the biggest difference between, let's go back to about 20 years ago,
Mm,
25 years ago, and up conversion came along. We got general coverage receivers, we got synthesizers, so we no longer had to have crystals for a band, and we got digital readout and no drifting and all that. But those radios that had this 15 or 20 kilohertz wide first IF roofing
mhm,
filter
right.
were poorly performing in CW contest pileups, DX, D expeditions and all that. So that was the big difference. I mean, if you look at all these radios, the sensitivities are about the same. The
Right.
noise floors are about the same. I mean, we've got preamps and we got attenuators and all that. But the difference for 25 years was like 20 or 30 dB for the big CW operators. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where I decide, okay, that's what I'm going to sort it by. But as if you've been to any of my presentations at Contest University or on the Zooms or whatever, you don't buy a radio on one number any more than you buy a sports car that can go 150 miles an hour, but you go around a corner and you end up in the ditch. So you need to look at the big picture and other things like reliability, user interface, price, of course. Uh, so there's lots of things to picking a radio, but this at least gives you a way to compare about 10, however many columns there are, 8 or 10. You can compare them directly with what you have or what you might want or what comes out, yes, tomorrow.
Yeah, and like so I have a number of radios. I mean, a lot of people know me because I have Flex. my decision for buying Flex wasn't necessarily the performance. All the performance was a factor. I like the, you know, I like the tech. Okay. So I already set up stage. I drive a Tesla because they have tech. Okay. Not necessarily for being quote unquote green, but but the tech is out of this world. Even though there are reliability problems, I live on the bleeding edge. Um, yeah, that's just how I am. The but no, the Flex gave me the ability to interface software and such like that and eliminate cables. I was running an Icom Pro 3, and that thing I had like a whole morass of cables behind it. But you know what? I have other radios. I have one of my favorite radios, believe it or not, is the Kenwood TS440, right? And that's because it's simple, and it's a Kenwood, and since it's a Kenwood, it's a tank, right?
And good
So
and good audio.
great audio. It was my first experience on HF, that radio. Noel 9Y4 X-ray, who was back then 9Y4 NED. He let me use his radio, and he had the one with the automatic tuner. So I'm going to take an audience question here. So how have SDRs changed the measurements?
Well, they really haven't, but you have to be careful. I mean, when we had nothing but super het radios, they were more consistent from sample to sample, and the way that they went into overload was pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we're going to say SDR, I don't like the term. I mean, if we're saying direct sampling, is that what the really question is? Are we comparing direct sampling to super hets or super het hybrids like the Kenwood or the Yaesu? Well, then ADC chips don't overload like a standard super het radio. And matter of fact, if you graph the distortion products, particularly with linearization off, and most of the radios that are direct sampling with an ADC chip and FPGAs and all that stuff, they vary because the chip varies. Not that the radio, your sample serial number 1111 changes, but the chip is different. So it's not ideal to test the same way with the direct sampling radios, but we don't really have much else. There's Adam Farson does some noise power ratio tests, and that's certainly some interesting data. But if we're careful about how we do the testing, and the AWRL does the same thing I do, and the RSGB with their measurements, we're doing the same thing. But the biggest difference, I'd say, of the SDR, meaning the direct sampling, is the gain structure out of the box without a preamp on and without an attenuator on is drastically different. The Flex has the least gain before you turn a preamp on. The K4 is next with sort of middle of the road. And then the Icom 7610, for instance, or the 7300, has the most gain with nothing else turned on. We have to realize that, because if you're on 40 meters at night, you don't need a preamp, and with an Icom, you probably need an attenuator. But like with the Flex, the 6600 or 6400, if the current models, if you're on 20 meters in a quiet location, you need a preamp, where you would never need a preamp on 20 meters with an Icom. So you really have to understand, if you have a direct sampling radio from the 3 or 4 major brands, including Apache, so that'd make 4, you really need to understand how your radio's net gain is, because it's vastly different from one model to the other.
So on the heels of that, it's hybrid SDR. So I'm going to break it down for some of the people who are not very technical. So basically, the SDR technology basically digitizes the signal almost straight from the antenna, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And the hybrid SDR, I think, does a little bit of filtering before it does that.
Well, it doesn't exist yet.
Oh, really?
Well, I mean, the K4HD doesn't exist except in theory. So there is no hybrid SDR at the moment. But at some point, you would have that option to add a board and obviously firmware updates to a K4, but we're not there.
Okay. So one thing that I kind of was watching this chart here, and let me bring up the chart again because I think it's important. You mentioned, I'm looking at the Icom 7300 here, right? You
And,
have the second sample.
there's two
Um,
samples.
right. There is something, a note about, what is this? About Digicel or something like that, or
But we'll just click on the footnote and we'll see what it is.
yeah, what is this?
Well,
This is a
well,
sensitivity.
that would just be preamp settings for those footnotes.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Audio DSP, RMDR.
okay,
So
so that was AB, measure with dither on.
yeah,
That's what.
IP, right. So what is this IP plus thing on? I should ask Reno back this last week, but what does that do to the performance?
Okay, IP plus happens to be Icom's name for dither linearization of the
Mm,
ADC chip.
okay.
Flex does it differently. Their chip
Oh.
does not have on-chip linearization, so they just do it a different way. Everybody else uses the same chip. It may be a 14-bit or 16-bit, but it's the same chip.
Mm-hmm.
And built in the chip is a way to make the distortion curve less of a curve and more of a straight line. So depending upon when the 7300 first came out, when you turned on IP plus, which is dither, it degraded the noise floor between 10 and 15 dB. They later fixed that somewhere before serial number 10,000. Of course, if you didn't turn it on, it didn't make any difference at all.
Right.
And then the 7610, it only degrades at about 3 dB, not much to talk about. The Apache about 1. So it's just a way to compensate for the fact that a digital chip is not a straight line as far as distortion, just like a old-fashioned superhead is. It's just different.
Okay. So I always thought it kind of like smoothed out things a little bit, kind of just with some additional
Well,
process.
yeah, right. Call it smoothing. That's fine. Good term.
Okay. Okay, that's good. Yeah, Don had a follow-up. He said he thought the 101D and FTDX10 are hybrid. I don't know about that.
Okay,
I
well,
don't have.
that's depending on how you're going to call SDR. I mean, I think for the most part, people have been talking about direct sampling as an SDR. So let's not worry about that term. A hybrid superhead, I mean the 101D and the 10 and the Kenwood 890S are hybrid superheads, meaning it's a superhead from the antenna to your speaker, but it has a direct sampling band scope. But the band scope has nothing to do with what's coming out your speaker or your headphones. So that's a hybrid superhead. And but that if Elecraft does ship a K4 HD sometime, you could call that a hybrid SDR or hybrid direct sampling, because it would be direct sampling if you turned on that feature, but it doesn't exist yet.
So I noticed some of these radios actually have like different, revisions of stuff where they perform better and some of them perform worse. Exactly what, what's been like your experience? Is it like come down to hardware? Because when we talk to, like, for example, like Flex Engineering had put out some, statement about how they, they took your feedback and they put some fixes in the software, but some of these apparently are hardware with some of these radios.
Well, in the case of the Flex, and I'm going to be completely candid on this.
Absolutely.
When the first Flex came out, the 6700, and as the load on the processor went up, as the firmware had more and more features, the chip was drawing enough current that it drew the regulation, the power supply out of regulation, and then the performance cratered. And actually, Adam Farson and I found that independent, and then of course Gerald got involved, and so they had to do a recall on all the 6700s to fix the fact that the power supply was going out of regulation. And unfortunately, I think the weakest point at Flex is in-house testing, and that's just my opinion, but every Flex that's come out, I've had to borrow one. However, I got a hold of it, definitely not directly from the factory. And a recall, or they call a PEN, performance enhancement notice, every time there was some hardware fix that was required, and they fixed it, and that's great. But it's sort of sad that I had to find the problem, because you'd hope that'd be found at the factory, but it was
Mhm.
fixed, and they, of course, did it at no charge.
Yeah, I mean they've been having some growing pains. They're compared to like some of the rest. They're a younger company. I mean they're still mature now. They've been around since like what 2002 or something like that now.
Whenever
Yeah,
the 1000 came out, but that was a totally different product, of course.
right. I think these first came out in like 2012 or something.
See, the
But
6700 came out in 2014,
yeah,
and I had
I
one
know
on
what they're
loan. I had one on loan from Gerald for about a year.
yeah, I know with their new military contracts and stuff. They put out presentations saying how they're going to be improving a lot of processes. So we'll see. But yeah, they're like I said, I live on the edge. I live on the bleeding edge a lot. So, um, but let's see here. So one of the other things I wanted to ask, and I was really curious about this because I talk about this in some of my presentations. This Hiberline radio, okay? I have seen these, and it's a magnificent piece of craftsmanship. My understanding is that he crafts these radios himself. He owns a company that makes aircraft radios. The price is high. I mean, you're basically buying like a Bentley, so to speak, right?
Right.
And or a high end AMG or something like that. Although I think they're owned by Volks. No, they're Daimler, or whatever they are, whatever name of the week's Daimler, Stellantis. I
So
lost
what do
track.
you want to know about the Hiberline? Because I did run one NC0B contest on 160
Uh,
meters.
So what I want to know is, this radio, is it fully superhet or is there some SDR in it?
It's fully superhet.
Mhm.
They at one point had there might be some audio DSP or something, and at one point they tried
Mhm.
to put audio derived AGC in there to compensate for the fact that you couldn't get a super narrow CW bandwidth, or let's not even say super narrow. Initially it was like 500 hertz, and then they eventually went down to 250, but
Mhm.
with a hardware update. But it's pretty much just called it the last of the super hits, but it's more of a sideband radio. Uh,
Yeah.
you can't go down to 100 hertz on CW. And believe me,
Okay.
in a contest, 100 or 150 hertz is pretty much required if you're in a big pilot.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
It was
Um.
about $18,000, and what it is right now, I don't know, because the euro's changing value is, actually, matter of fact, almost parity with the dollar now. So I'd hate to think what it costs today.
Yeah, I think they actually dipped below the dollar for a little bit. I think
Yeah,
they
you're right.
might be. Yeah, they're pretty much parity. It's like $1 is 1,008,106 euros, and €1 is actually less than a dollar right now. All the
So
war in Ukraine is kind of taking a
So
toll.
maybe the price has gone down since that's changed. So maybe if you want a Hilberling, maybe it'd only be $16,000 now. Who knows?
Yeah, no, I think I have to fix some things in my house before I buy that.
But
But
the
what was
Hilberling was at the top of my chart for a while,
uh-huh.
and that was Hans Hilberling's goal. That doesn't mean it was the perfect radio, but
Mhm.
he designed some things, and guess what? I found some things wrong with it, and he
Mhm.
flew out along with Jan, and we showed him what was wrong, and he went back to Germany and fixed it, and then Jan came out and modified the one that I had for a while, which of course eventually went back to the factory. So
Mhm.
that was another case where testing didn't catch some things.
Okay. I'll take one more receiver question, then we're going to shift to the next topic here. How's everyone like the 7610 Icom? What's your experience like testing that radio?
Well, okay, for full disclosure, I'm going to say what I've owned over time, and I currently own three 7610s, so I obviously
Mm,
like it. And my
yeah.
contest station has 3 operating positions.
Mhm.
I'm not a multi-op setup. What I do is set up the rigs for one on 10, 15, and 20 in the daytime, and 40, 80, and 160 at night. That's just how I happen to do it. Change chairs
Right.
to change bands. But I've owned National, uh, Johnson, Kenwood, Icom. So a lot of brands over time, but currently I happen to be in the Icom world. I had the TS990 and the TS890. So, And as far as what I operated, then in the top 22 that's on this list, not the top 22, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the top 22 models, different models, I've run 17 of them in a major contest. So I get to do that. That's what's really nice about this new place out here in the country.
Okay.
So is it popular? Obviously it is. And of course it hasn't sold in the quantities of the 7300. The price difference is like 3 to 1.
Yeah. What I like about that radio is that it is. So one presentation I attended with Tim Duffy was K3LR. Those who don't know who he is, he gave a presentation and said, a lot of hams still like knobs, right? And the
Right.
7610 gives them the best of both worlds. It gives them the SDR performance and gives them a familiar knobs. And then I was talking with Ray last week. We're talking about the 905, where the 905 has a 705 interface, so it's not a big learning curve to go between both. Whereas with something like a Flex, you have to mouse around and figure out. Even the Maestro is a little, the departure from regular radios.
Well, if you can run a 7300 and if you can't get on the air for 5 hours and not talk to a 7300, if you can run it, everyone works the same way. I mean, there's obviously more features in a 705 or a 9700 that I own, and this 905 that doesn't exist yet as far as selling it, but they all have the same user interface. And so that's just fantastic.
Okay. So Brian asks, what is the most annoying way people misuse your data?
Okay. The most annoying is this one number that I sorted it by, which was close in dynamic range, that's the only number it matters. And that's just silliness. Right. We don't buy a radio for one thing. And I'm in almost every presentation, whether it's at Contest University or a Zoom presentation, that maybe 10 things that we need to look at when we're buying a radio. And one thing with how noisy it is in a typical urban environment, you might pick a radio that has the best noise blanking and the best noise reduction just because you're trying to cope with this ever-present noise. So that's the problem. I mean, if we go back in, say, between 10 years ago and 30 years ago, the difference in the performance of the radios was drastic. But now you can buy like 20 plus radios that have almost 100 dB dynamic range. Well, that didn't used to be the case. I mean, we had radios that are 60 and 50 and 70. So now you have a lot of choices from every brand.
Amazing stuff. Okay. All right, so let's talk about transmitters, because I know that's your new project, sort of. It's not really new, but it's something you've taken interest in, right? And so tell me why you've added transmitters now to your list of tests, basically. So I attended, remember, 6 Meter Barbecue was an event that used to be held in Austin, Texas every year, right? It was a really nice event. It was a group of local hams, and they basically put together an event that where they talk about VHF operating. Then I saw your presentation about transmitters. So tell me why you've taken this on.
Receivers have gotten so good today, assuming we've got something you purchased in the last 5 to 7 years, that there's no point in trying to squeeze another few dB out of performance in the radios. They're just phenomenal. But unfortunately, the transmitters have gone downhill. The cleanest transmitter I've ever owned was a Collins 32S3, which of course had 6146s in it, negative feedback. And not only were the intermodulation numbers good, but they fell off much faster than current products. The only other rig that I've used that was very clean on sideband was the FTDX 5000, or the Mark V would be an example. And Yaesu had Class A and 3 different rigs. Two of them are 200 watt rigs, which meant they were a 75 watt rig on sideband. Or there was the Mark V Field, which was just a weird rig that didn't sell. So Class A was also extremely clean. So that's not the only thing that's important is splatter, but key clicks on CW. In some of the older Yaesu rigs were horrible, and Tom Rouse, W8JI, would talk about that
Mhm.
these radios had key clicks, 5 or 10 kilohertz wide. No excuse for that today. There are some that let you go into a menu and adjust the rise time and therefore the fall time. And if you pick a number that's available but it's a terrible choice, that's terrible, because there's no reason the OEM should let you have a clicky signal. The last one is a bit esoteric, mostly a problem if you're line of sight. Well, field day would obviously fit that, but if you've got a neighbor 10 blocks away, let alone some that I know they have another ham 500 feet away, well, transmit composite noise is a problem. Some rigs are
Mhm.
way better than others by 20 or 25 dB. So transmit composite noise means phase noise plus AM noise. Now, in a
Right.
perfect world, Ulrich Rhoda said, well, we shouldn't have to worry about AM noise, but we don't have a perfect world. And as a matter of fact, the Icom 7300, particularly when backed off to 30 watts, where the league tests a lot of rigs today at 100 watts and 30 watts, if it's a 100-watt rig, that the AM noise dominates over phase noise drastically. So,
Hmm.
and that's something the league can't measure right at the moment, but they're going to do that. That's one
Yeah,
of the
they're
things
working
on the
on it.
list. Yep, for sure.
Mhm.
So the bands are, in contest weekends, the bands are just wall to wall. And if
Oh
you're
yeah.
if you're splattering, if you got terrible key clicks, that's not fair. I mean, Tim K3LR really focuses on be a good neighbor on the band. I mean, every contest university starts out with this: be a good neighbor, because if you're taking up twice as much space, that's just not the way to be an amateur radio operator.
You're a lid.
Yeah, right, right.
I will come out and say it. You're a lid. There's this guy from Russia who famously is YouTube famous now because he had a signal that looked like basically a dragonfly. So you have his thing here, and every time he talks, yeah. Okay.
Well, one of
So
the contests I operated, AWRL 10 meters, a couple of years ago, there was one station that had key clicks 50 kilohertz wide, and one
mm,
station that had uh, transmit phase noise, transmit composite noise 35 kilohertz wide. So obviously it wasn't hard to find them, and I wrote down their calls. Well, something was broken on their radios, because no radio today that's not broken is going to be that bad, but boy, they were on the air making a mess.
yeah, I found this presentation of yours, and here you have like the 10-meter Sunday afternoon,
Yeah.
over 20 stations and 10 kilohertz.
And that was, in 2018. So that wasn't the sunspot. That was near the sunspot minimum.
Mhm.
Do you have the next slide? The one that's on 160 meters? Yeah, that was the one I really like.
Oh wow.
It shows a lot more than I ever
Mhm.
thought when I took this picture with my iPhone. This wasn't
Yeah.
anything high tech here. So you can see a lot of stations, 30 stations in 10 kilohertz, a lot stronger than on 10 meters. No surprise until we get more sunspots. I'm running the audio peak filter. If you look at the upper middle, it's got a red arrow. So, of course, the audio
Right.
peak filter is something the 7610 has and the 7300 does not. The
Mhm.
FTDX10 has an audio peak filter, and it's a less expensive rig. Well, here was the amazing thing: was look at the difference on the key clicks of these two signals. The one
Yeah.
on the left that says key clicks 5x. Look at that. You can see it on the band scope. You can see it on the waterfall. And then over on the right, that station's like 3 dB weaker, insignificant. Look how narrow that guy is on the waterfall. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like a night and day.
Hmm. That's interesting. And then so we get into the next point. The solution apparently to this with modern radio. So first of all, let's define the problem. Right? You have the clicks and the transmitter. What about amplifiers?
Oh, well, for sure. I mean, amplifiers, today, most everyone wants a solid state amp. I don't own one because I don't think
Mhm.
they're clean enough for me, but they're handy. I mean, they follow your transceiver around and you get to run a kilowatt and never have to tune
Yeah.
it. So, who wouldn't want that? But it's a trade-off. If you took ARRL data from 1997 on tube amps and then compare that to the ARRL reviews of LD MOS amps, the tube amps are 10 to 20 dB cleaner. Now,
Hmm.
if you're if your rig's not clean, well, it isn't going to make it much worse. But if you're running like a TS990, which is 10 dB cleaner than most people's rigs, and then you run it through an LDMOS amp, guess what? It degrades it. So but there is a solution, which you're about to show here, to besides, for instance, well, like the Class A. My friend W6XX, who's unfortunately SK now, he had a Mark V Yaesu in Class A driving an 8877. And his signal was astoundingly clean, even with the 8877 and no pre-distortion or no fancy way to clean it up, just because he knew how to operate the rig and had one of the better tubes on the market. So, but most of us don't have that. So here's a picture. So here's a picture on the left. Now you see this with our radios today that have direct sampling scopes, whether it's a direct sampling radio or a direct sampling scope like the Yaesu and the new Kenwood. Then you can see the reality if the signal's strong enough. I mean, if the signal's S9 and your noise level's S7, you're never going to see splatter.
Right.
But if this was on 20 meters, as you can see, and the signals were like 20/9, and you can see the splatter sidebands of the guy on the left. Well, the guy on the right was running an Apache with pre-distortion. They named it Pure Signal, written by NC0B, who lives in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so they, in effect, put in inverse distortion. It dynamically measures from moment to moment what the distortion is like in your rig and your amplifier, your linear amplifier, and then like invert it, in effect, feed it back in and cancel out the distortion. So you can see how clean that is. It's just a rectangle on the right. Now, he was running hi-fi SSB. So he was way wider than I would be running it, but that was his choice. That's KA0KA. So it's possible to make at least a 20 dB improvement in our signals once more OEMs start offering pre-distortion.
All right. First, I'd like to acknowledge T-Ray for the super chat. Thank you very much. Don't worry, you can always catch some stuff you missed on Team Replay. But ESSB, so you mentioned ESSB. ESSB is a bad thing, is it? Or
no, I don't consider that. It depends how far you push it and what the band conditions are. And for instance, the K4, you can run ESSB, that's enhanced single sideband, call it hi-fi single sideband, and be 3 kilohertz wide. Well, my Icom rig, I've got it set up so it's 100 to 2900. So in other words, it's 2.8 kilohertz wide. So if somebody that's 3 kilohertz wide, big deal. It really comes down to splatter. So most of the hi-fi guys that are talking about 3, 4, 5 kilohertz wide, they're on one frequency on 20 meters, or they're on one frequency on 40 meters. They don't bother anybody any more than slow scan the guys. So I don't consider it a big deal.
Or AM, I mean, I see like AM guys on 75, and you know what? They're doing their thing,
Yeah, like they're on a couple of frequencies, period.
Yeah. One thing, so K4AX, K4AX asks, what's AM noise versus phase noise? What is that?
Okay. Well, phase noise, any oscillator has a certain amount of frequency jitter. And of course, synthesizers had way more frequency jitter than like a crystal oscillator and a PTO, like in a Collins or a Drake. So we've got a synthesizer. Now, the improvement in the last 5 years on synthesizers is dramatic. The TS890S or the FTDX101 or the 10, astounding improvement. But AM noise is just amplitude noise. It shouldn't really be there, but if it is, it adds up. So what you hear on the air is a combination of phase noise, and if there's AM noise, that adds up too. If they were equal, if phase noise equaled AM noise, then the total noise would be 3 dB higher. My example of the 7300 at 30 watts at 20 kilohertz offset, the AM noise is 18 dB, 18 dB stronger than the phase noise, which is bizarre. But most of the time it's not that way. A K3, for instance, has almost no difference between the phase noise and the composite noise because the AM noise is very low.
Right. So some Don. So let me address this with Don. So Don says the Hermes light is $300 already has per signal. Well, yeah, that's because I think it's like the Apache is basically an Hermes with, custom stuff, and they're basically the same radio, kind of, right?
Well, the Apache has obviously just makes hardware and is now made in
Yeah.
Australia, was in India. And
Oh.
then the software is 100% open source. Warren Pratt writes Pure Signal. He writes Spectral Noise Blanker and all sorts of noise mitigation. Other
Mm,
people write the interface, which is like 99% been rewritten from the days of the early Flex. I mean, Power SDR probably started being used, but now what Apache publishes and what you can download is nothing to do with the old Flex software.
right. Okay. So yeah. So this is something I always wondered, but this is news to me that they moved to Australia. Wow. That's interesting. They they are that's really interesting. So that's good. But this guy Ashar Farhan was talking to me about some radio he was working on, and he's good friends. Obviously, they're in India, so he knows Apache Labs people very well. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. I'm sure a lot of people come here. Let's talk about the Baofangs. there is a there is a whole rash of these new radios, and I mean rash in a good way. Okay, that are coming from China. Okay, I mean, I'll say it right out. They're coming from China, and a lot of these radios really early on they were hardly out of FCC spec, and then
Yep.
later on they kind of improved a little bit. So, have you been doing anything with that? I know the AWR lab has been doing stuff, and I actually have another video on that. So, tell
No,
me a little bit about that.
no, I don't test HTs at all. In fact, I don't even own one. I did back in the 70s when we
Mhm.
all wanted auto patch, but when's the last time you heard auto patch? But Bob Allison would be at like Dayton Hamvention or Huntsville or
Mm,
wherever, and you could take your HT in and they test it for you. I mean, you're right. The pretty much half of them made in China of whatever different brands, and Bofang was probably the best known, but
mm,
just wait nowhere near spec. So, uh, but there's so many that just isn't my world of testing. It, you know, there's so many radios to keep track of that I have to limit what I test. I don't even test every little dongle, like a SDR play or something. I just can't test
okay.
everything that comes down the pike.
Right. But there are issues of spectral purity, and I took in a lot of heat from people who basically said, "Well, this is going like 5 miles over the speed limit." I mean, I think, and thank you, Mike Valentine. I've avoided any speeding tickets so far.
Well, I sometimes you can have spurious that's stronger than the fundamental. I did test a
Mhm,
radio that had a accessory 2 meter accessory that you could put in there, and the fundamental was X, and the one of the harmonics or spurious was like 10 dB stronger. So those
mhm.
are the things that can go wrong, and it might end up on a CAP frequency or some airport frequency. So this is not something to sneeze at.
Okay. Okay. And then, so in terms of like testing, you test some VHF transceivers, do you or not?
Yes, I mean that's relatively new, and there's I think 3 or 4 on my website. So we've got
Okay.
the
Let me
the
take a look and see
yeah, sure,
here.
the 736R, obviously the
Okay.
9700 from Icom,
Mhm,
and I had an older Icom, which was the IC275H. I did give a presentation that was totally focused on VHF, UHF stuff, and that was fascinating. That was in the UK, and then input from the continent. So the thing that's interesting, if we look at the big picture of what's possible with an HF rig that goes up through 6 meters today,
mm,
once we get to 2 meters, the drop off in receiver performance is drastic. The the increase in transmitted noise. I mean, the people that are really serious VHF, UHF contesters, which probably include you, Rhea,
yeah.
uh, the the only way to coexist, like if you're on a mountaintop in the East Coast or you're over in Europe somewhere, we've got people running 20 dBi antennas and big linears, but they say in order to not be wiping out the band, you may have a 1 kilowatt or a 2 kilowatt linear run it at 400 watts, which a lot of the countries have a 400 watt limit. So this is a struggle to produce the quality of cleanliness that we have on HF now for the best rigs, and the VHF hasn't caught up yet.
So that's pretty interesting. What do you think about transverter versus transverter and HF radio versus a dedicated VHF rig?
That's where this input from this UK presentation, which was with, I see it was, I'm trying to think the right name, but anyway, it doesn't matter. They said there's no question that right now, the really good transverters with a very clean exciter, in other words, the rig, run circles around anything on the market. But of course, you wouldn't want to pick a poor choice to hook up to your transverter. So that's where we are today, at least as of a couple of years ago, and I don't think it's changed.
Okay. I see DJ0IP has a good thing on your on the IC9700. Let me see if I could share that, because that's an interesting thing. Let me just get this here.
Yeah, Rick republishes, DJ0IP publishes a lot of things that I don't have on my website, and he has a lot of information from tuners to some of my things and antennas, and so a great place to go. Just do a Google on DJ0IP, and it's a lot of fun there.
So Don asked, what about frequency drift above 440? Now, my personal experience. So you mentioned I'm a big VHF contester. I'm kind of like in the learning mode. Andrea K2EZ, who I haven't contested in a while, she is the big time rover gal. Okay, she is the Miss Rover. Okay, I'm just shotgun. Right,
you're your sister rover, huh?
Yeah, I kind of, you know what it is with me. I came there and, I operated FT8 and I operated some sideband, and but then she got busy, and then pandemic and all this stuff. So, So frequency drift above 440. What I have a GPS DO on my rig, right?
And what's your rig?
The Flex with transverters.
Okay, with transverters. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and, I mean, it varies. I mean, the FT736R, if you put in the high performance oscillator, or maybe even came with it, I don't remember, pretty stable. The 9700, when it first came out, before they sort of did some software updates that somewhat fixed the problem, it was terrible. You could be drifting, hundreds of hertz on 70 centimeters. I hook a Wenzel oscillator, 10 megahertz Wenzel oscillator up to my IC9700, warm the oscillator up, half an hour ahead of time, leave it on all weekend. So that helps a lot. So yes, that's an issue. And now, of course, we've got this Icom 905 that has the possibility of picking up the GPS from the satellites. We're talking about an accessory now that goes up to 10 gigahertz. Well, you sure as heck need to know you're not only stable, but on frequency.
Yeah. What about the Leo Bodnar GPS reference rigs? I guess
very, very popular.
Okay.
It's unfortunate Icom goofed up, because, like, for instance, my 7610 and before my TS890S, I could put a 10 megahertz reference in there. It could be a GPS disciplined oscillator. It could be a Wenzel. It could be a rubidium. I've got a rubidium at both QTHs.
Yeah.
But they goofed it up. I mean, I need a rubidium like a hole in the head on 20 meters, but I certainly need it on 440. So that was dumb. But, engineering mistakes happen.
Yeah.
The K4, I hope that works out well from a standpoint of we have a transverters or accessory module or something like that. The K3 doesn't phase lock, and so I don't know if the K4 actually phase locks or not. It was sort of a continual calibration like the 9700 is now, so it's slightly different.
Yeah. So here we have the thing the DJ0IP published here, with your 9700 comprehensive testing. Right. You have the dynamic range. And then, if you compare this like an HF radio, this seems pretty dismal. But then you have to consider that this is VHF, and things do drop off because of components. I guess they kind of like, you have to trade off costs and performance and components, right?
Right. I mean, if the 9700 would cost $5,000, probably wouldn't
Mm.
be very popular.
Right, exactly. But it costs like what, 1,500 now? I'm not sure.
Yeah, something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
I think when I bought mine, it was 2100 because I got one quickly because people wanted to test it, and I just had to bite the bullet.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, really, realistically, you probably the dynamic range, um, that mountaintop scenario. Because one time, Andrea and I, we went up on somewhere in Pennsylvania, and there was cell towers on the mountains, and oh my God, that thing blew us out. Okay.
Yeah.
And there was some other thing that was operating on 900 megs, so that band was out for us, right? But we were able to do 2 meters, 70 SAMs. We were able to do, I think we did some 10 gigahertz because I think she had just gotten a 10 gigahertz rate, and that was that was doable. But yeah, oh yeah, you know what? It also wiped out 1.2, you know, 1.2 gig. So this is good stuff. Okay. All right. We're kind of a little over time. Anything else that you think that our audience should know? And Silver Stacks Prepper, first of all, thank you very much. Awesome. Nice to see you here. Okay.
Let me make one comment about what you can see
Mhm.
on a direct sampling scope. In this case, with like a 9700 on 2 meters. I'm here in Colorado. There's no pileups of signals on the VHF UHF contest, but you can see what everybody's signals like,
Mhm.
and it's disappointing that some people on 2 meters run an FM brick, just a solid state amp that was meant to be used on FM to take your walkie-talkie up to 100 watts or whatever. We use
Mhm.
that on sideband. It's just awful, and you can see that on the band scope. So this is where we really need to have education. The league can, have
Yeah.
articles on what not to do on 2 meters or 20 or 70 centimeters. Don't put these brick amplifiers on your rig. Do something else that's going to be clean.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to figure out how I could get some of the league folks on here. That's believe it or not, that's easier said than done.
Do you want to mention CSI?
Yes. So one final thing, my colleague Mike Ritz at ARRL has, shown us the way with this Clean Signal initiative. So tell us a little bit more about CSI ham radio.
Well, if you go back to November of 2019, I wrote an article in QST about it's time to clean up our signals. And actually,
Mhm.
the ARRL wrote the title. And how that happened was I was asked to do a paper for QAX on transmit composite noise. And I thought, well, that's not the major thing. We've got these other things, key clicks and sideband splatter. So I wrote the article on everything, and they said, oh, we're going to put that in QST. Well, that was
Mhm.
a surprise, and it was great. So anyway, the point was that the receivers are now amazing, and the transmitters need work, but we need to push the OEMs to improve. And competition is wonderful, and obviously competition in the receive side was phenomenal. I mean, everybody had these radios that were about 70 dB dynamic range, 70, and then the Orion 1 came along, and then the Orion 2, and then the K3, and suddenly the world changed, and everybody had to catch up. So
Mhm.
we need to start looking at more details on the product reviews. And I think the idea is to kind of give gold stars. So if you had a
Mhm.
radio that was unusually good on, let's say, key clicks, which for instance, the 101D is, as long as you set it for 6 millisecond rise time.
Mhm.
And then if a rig had unusually good splatter, like the Apache does with pure signal, which is pre-distortion, then they should get a gold star. That's harder to do, obviously, since right now only one OEM does it, but we're hoping to have 3. So then the last one, composite noise, I don't think that was paid attention to. It was kind of a shock when people started measuring it and found like, oops, this rig has a problem. So that's a case where it isn't so much the league's going to say, well, this rig's no good, but they want to give like gold stars for the ones that are outstanding. And they think that's good. And hopefully competition will matter. Now, here's the thing that people talk about. Well, some people will say, well, the contesters want to be wide. Well, some do, but that's terrible. So you would hope that we could educate the hams to say, we want to have a nice narrow signal, no key clicks on CW, no splatter on sideband. and make the hobby more fun.
Hmm. Yeah, being wide is one thing, but I think being wide could get you disqualified in some contests now. Like
Well,
they,
you're
yeah.
right on the CQ contest. Whether they enforce it much, I'm not sure, but they do have the rules. I was disappointed the ARRL did not decide to take the same limitations the
Mhm.
same requirements that CQ magazine contests do, and I think the league should do the same thing because there's no reason to have a ridiculous signal on the air.
So this is where I kind of tell people, sometimes it's hard to stay separate between official ARRL positions and my own. I agree with you, Rob. I really do think so that we should be, as part of our, whole push to get cleaner signals, put it in the contest rules. But you know what? I don't know why. I'm guessing either it just hasn't been brought up yet, or it could be some people think it might, you know, might offend some people. Some think it might, and I'll probably get an email about my
Right.
if I said
Well,
that.
the
you know,
answer was that there
yeah,
was some pushback. I
yeah,
consider that too bad.
yeah.
I mean, anytime a signal is awful, I mean, one or two things happen. Either, like if I tune one, let's say it's on sideband, the guy's just super wide.
Mhm,
If I comment, he probably ignores me. But what I do is mostly a search and pounce operator, since it's kind of hard in Colorado to run on 40 meters with a normal setup, that I just won't work them. Now,
mhm.
admittedly, one less point doesn't matter, but if we all said we're not going to work those guys that are just ridiculous, maybe they'd get the picture.
Yeah, like some of these, and I hate to pick on countries, some of these people out of Eastern Europe, especially. Oh my God, it's like they're taking up half the band. You know,
Yeah.
it's like I'm sorry, they're probably running a lot of power to be fair, but it's just ridiculous.
Well,
But
if a station's plus or minus 20 kilohertz,
mm,
his rig isn't that bad. I mean, there no rig that's not broken isn't that bad, but they're flat topping their linear by how many dB I don't know, but there's just that's just unacceptable.
yeah. So anyway, yeah, that was something else. So the Clean Signal Initiative, I'll probably see if I could get somebody to talk about it. But it's going to be basically. I did a video about uh, the video about my how they test my rig, and they gave me a little sticker on it too, right? That said tested by AWR Lab. Eventually, what Ed Hare told me is that they're gonna like try to make this into an IEEE standard or something. I don't know.
Well, that may be, but that's sort of I consider that sort of beside the point. I mean, the league is going to try to
Yeah.
in suggest or push OEMs to improve the areas that are now the limitation. I mean, right now, with all the rigs that are so good on
Mm,
CW, particularly, that the limitation is the guy that's 1, 2, 3 kilohertz away. And
mm,
so, and your rig, you can have brick wall filters and receive, and the guy's key clicks are in the passband. It's there. So that's where we
yeah.
need to really fix it.
So yeah, they paid for 25 kilowatts, and they're going to use all of them. Oh my God. Anyway, Rob, this was really fun. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but you know what? I had to keep you on a little longer. This was so interesting. Thank you very much for reaching out to me. So I'll tell you something. Rob's on my show last week with Ray, and he had to come on, and I jumped at the opportunity because I wanted to interview Rob for a long time. Oh gosh, Arnold, one last one. Have you had any info on a new modulation setup that Elecraft is working on that they claim 8 dB talk increase over 100 watts?
Okay, I can certainly comment on that.
Yeah.
This is very confused on what happens on the K4 reflector, is what this is all about.
Hmm.
Dave Hirschberger wrote a paper up. It was presented at Dayton. It's been written up in QEX a couple times, and that's reduces overshoot because if you process a sideband signal and then you have to run it through a cleanup, an upper or lower sideband filter, either a real filter like crystal filter or it's done in DSP, it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
It causes some overshoot, about 2.5 dB. So there was a trade-off there between turning on the Hirschberger algorithm. It improves the peak to average ratio, by about 2.5 dB. It adds a little bit of distortion, not a lot, but you can hear it. But the rest of this nominal 8 dB or 6 dB, I think the last time Wayne mentioned it, is the speech processor. So when you have your K4 sent to 0 compression, the Hirschberger CESSB, that's controlled envelope single sideband, is off. You turn the compression to 1, it's on, and it stays on. And then you just keep turning the knob from 1 to 30. It just adds more and more compression. So everybody's rig offers compression, speech processing, whatever you want to call it. Apache has CESSB, that's the Hirschberger. Flex has the CESSB. So I thought it's kind of misleading in the QST review of the K4 that it was almost like, well, only Elecraft has this. That's not true. Icom doesn't have it. Kenwood doesn't have it. Yaesu doesn't have it, but those three I mentioned do. So it's an addition to speech processing that improves the peak to average ratio 2 dB or so.
Okay, well, that's good. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much, Rob, and thank you everybody for for coming on and asking their questions and being interactive. You know what? I know this was a little, very technical discussion. I enjoy that a lot of times. But I'm sure some people learned something tonight. And then Arnold, would you say this is a good thing for the bands? I don't know.
What's good for the bands?
The whole modulation setup that Elecraft and others have.
Well, processing's good. I run it. Who doesn't use some sort of speech processing?
Right.
That doesn't mean it's going to splatter. The limitation on our rigs, I mean, most all our rigs run on 13.8 volts. And the distortion products of our solid state rigs or our amplifiers, they are what they are. And until pre-distortion comes from Elecraft and from Flex, we have what we have. And maybe then, and now we know that Icom's announced it. So isn't that tremendous?
Yeah, that's that. And I think that's going to light a fire under a lot of other manufacturers to put it on.
I mean, they're kind of the elephant in the room. So if Icom's making a big deal of it, how the other is not going to say, oops, I better pay attention. But here's the amazing thing. It's going to work with the 7610. My guess is part of it's in the PW2. So I don't think my alphas will work. But the fact that it was already built in a 7610, well, that came out 5 years ago. And the design had to be like at least 7 years ago. So Icom's been thinking about pre-distortion for at least 7 years. Apache had pre-distortion 9 years ago. So this is great that they were, it was on their radar.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, adaptive pre-distortion, how it can be likened by is you're driving on the road and your car pulls a little bit to the right. Well, you just pull the steering wheel, you feel that, and you pull a little bit to the left. That's the simplest explanation I can give.
Well, I call it inverse distortion.
Right. Okay. Rob, thank you very much. And you're welcome again anytime, and we talk more stuff. I guess I'll probably bring you on when we have some big new radio announcements so you could talk about its performance and you get one in your hands and you do your independent testing. All right.
Well, we're waiting for the 710 from Yaesu. And of course, we're waiting for the PW2. So I paid my $35 and I reserved a peak of PW2, which I'll plug into my 7610 and we'll see how it works.
Great. All right, my friends. Well, thank you for watching Live with Ria. Be sure to like and subscribe. And we have a lot more videos coming up. We've been talking with Rob, NC0B, Rob Sherwood from Sherwood Engineering. You can check out his website at SHERW.
Just do NC0B.com.
Oh, okay. So you can do NC0B.com and you get his website. Okay, great. And then, it's right here. And you can see all the receiver test data. You can see all the products he used to sell. And then receiver test data. And you see this whole chart. It's a very basic bare bones website, but you know what? Simple is best sometimes. And it has a whole bunch of stuff. And if you really want to nerd out, you can read his whole explanation of all these receiver test data, right? Terms explained, if you really want to dig deep into receiver performance.
And if anyone has questions from tonight or any of the other presentations they've seen of mine on the web, which are a lot of them there, Rob at NC0B.com, Rob at NC0B.com, and I'll answer your emails.
Yeah, so that's Rob at NC0B.com. And I put in a comment here, so you can do Rob at NC0B.com, and you can definitely reach out to him. All right, thank you, and have a happy Labor Day. Okay.
All right. Have a good barbecue or something. Bye-bye.
All right, you take care. Oops.